Everyone laughed when the farmer bought a rusted wind turbine for his last $500. They called him insane, a fool throwing away money on worthless scrap metal. But what he discovered hidden inside changed everything and made those same people fall silent in shock. Subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you're watching this video from. The dust hung thick in the air of the county auction yard, swirling in lazy spirals under the harsh afternoon sun. Thomas Brennan stood at the edge of the crowd, his calloused hands shoved deep into the pockets of his worn denim jacket. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Watching the auctioneer's mouth move in rapid-fire cadence. Around him, dealers and scrap merchants shuffled impatiently, their eyes scanning the lots with the practiced indifference of men who made their living from other people's discarded dreams. Thomas was 53 years old. Though the lines etched deep around his eyes and the grey threading through his dark hair made him look older. His farm, 200 acres of stubborn clay soil in western Kansas, had been in his family for 3 generations. But 3 years of drought followed by his wife, Sarah's long battle with cancer, had drained everything. The medical bills alone had forced him to sell half his equipment, then his livestock, and finally most of the land itself, keeping only the 40 acres where the old farmhouse stood. Now, he lived alone in that house, its empty rooms echoing with memories of better times. His 2 daughters had moved to the city years ago, promising to visit, but rarely making the trip. His neighbors, the same families he'd known his entire life, had begun to look at him differently, not with cruelty, but with something worse. Pity, mixed with relief that his misfortune wasn't theirs. The auctioneer's voice cut through his thoughts. Next up, Lot 47. Decommissioned wind turbine. Approximately 70 feet tall, non-operational. Sold as is for parts or scrap. Opening bid, $500. A ripple of laughter passed through the crowd. The turbine stood behind the auctioneer like a rusted giant, its 3 massive blades frozen at odd angles, its white paint peeled away to reveal corroded metal beneath. It had been part of a failed wind farm project 15 years earlier, one of a dozen turbines that had operated for barely 2 years before the company went bankrupt and abandoned them. This was the last one remaining, the others already cut up and sold for scrap. Thomas stared at it, and something stirred in his chest. Not logic or reason, but an instinct he couldn't name. The turbine reminded him of himself, weathered, broken, left behind, but still standing. $500, the auctioneer repeated. Do I hear 500? Anyone? The crowd was silent, except for a few snickers. Someone behind Thomas muttered, "Might as well burn your money. Save yourself the trouble of hauling that piece of junk." Thomas's hand went up before he could stop himself. The auctioneer blinked in surprise, then recovered quickly. "We have 500. Going once, going twice." He paused, giving anyone else a chance to bid, but only laughter answered. Sold to bidder 73. As Thomas walked to the payment table, he heard the whispers following him like a swarm of wasps. "That's Tom Brennan. Lost everything after his wife died. Guess he finally lost his mind, too." Another voice, dripping with false sympathy. "Poor old fool. $500 is probably all he has left in the world." They weren't wrong. The $500 was exactly what remained in his account after paying that month's property taxes. He had planned to use it for seed and supplies. A last, desperate attempt to plant something, anything, on his remaining land. Now he had signed it away for a rusted tower of metal that everyone agreed was worthless. The young woman at the payment desk gave him a pitying smile as she processed his payment. "Mr. Brennan, you know this turbine hasn't worked in over a decade, right? And you'll need to hire someone to dismantle it and transport it. That could cost thousands." "I'll manage," Thomas said quietly, signing the paperwork with a hand that didn't shake despite the gnawing certainty that he had just made a catastrophic mistake. As he walked back to his truck, he passed a group of men he'd known since childhood. Jake Morrison, who owned the successful cattle ranch to the north, called out, "Hey Tom, you planning to generate power with that thing, or just use it as the world's most expensive scarecrow?" The others laughed, and Thomas kept walking. Their mockery stung less than their eyes, which held the bright gleam of people watching a neighbor's slow collapse and feeling secretly grateful it wasn't happening to them. He drove home in silence, the sun setting behind him, painting the endless Kansas sky in shades of amber and rust that matched the turbine he'd just bought. When he pulled up to his farmhouse, the place looked as abandoned as he felt. Weeds had overtaken Sarah's vegetable garden. The barn sagged slightly to one side, paint peeled from the house's wooden siding in long, curling strips. That night, Thomas sat on his porch, drinking black coffee and staring out at his empty fields. The wind, which had tormented this land for decades, whispered through the grass with a sound like distant voices. He thought about the turbine, wondered what madness had possessed him to buy it, and felt the familiar weight of failure pressing down on his shoulders. But beneath the regret, something else flickered. A small, stubborn ember of defiance. Everyone had written him off. Everyone assumed he was finished. Maybe they were right. But he had learned something during Sarah's illness, watching her fight for every single day. That surrender came in many forms. The quietest kind was simply accepting what everyone else believed about you. He finished his coffee, went inside, and lay awake for hours, listening to the wind rattle the windows and thinking about 3 frozen blades spinning against an empty sky. The next morning, he called every transport company within 100 miles. Most hung up when they heard what he wanted moved. The few who listened quoted prices that would require him to mortgage his remaining land, if any bank would even consider lending to him. Finally, he found a grizzled hauler named Dutch, who agreed to do it for $800, payment in installments. "You're either crazy or desperate," Dutch said over the phone. "Maybe both. I'll be there Tuesday." Thomas hung up and stared at the calendar on his kitchen wall, at the red circles marking overdue bills and the empty squares stretching into an uncertain future. He had no idea how he'd pay Dutch, let alone what he'd do with the turbine once it arrived. He only knew he couldn't stop now. The word spread fast. By Monday afternoon, it seemed everyone within 20 miles knew that Tom Brennan had not only bought a worthless wind turbine, but was actually having it delivered to his property. The story grew with each telling. Some said he was trying to restart the wind farm himself. Others claimed he'd lost his mind completely and thought the rusted turbine would somehow save his farm. His daughter Rachel called that evening. "Dad, I heard what you did. Are you okay? Do you need me to come out there?" The concern in her voice made something crack inside his chest. "I'm fine, sweetheart. Just trying something new." "Dad, people are saying you spent your last money on scrap metal. Tell me that's not true." He couldn't lie to her. The silence stretched between them, heavy with all the words neither of them knew how to say. "I have to go, Rachel. I'll call you soon." He hung up before she could respond, before the worry in her voice could make him doubt himself more than he already did. Tuesday arrived with a pale grey dawn. Thomas was already awake, had been for hours, standing in his driveway and watching the eastern horizon. When Dutch's flatbed truck finally appeared, crawling down the dirt road with the turbine tower sections chained to its bed, Thomas felt his heart hammering against his ribs. The truck pulled into his property, followed by a smaller vehicle carrying the enormous fiberglass blades. Dutch climbed out, a bear of a man with a weathered face and eyes that had seen too much to judge anyone. "Where do you want it?" "Where?" Thomas pointed to a flat area behind his barn, where the ground was solid and the wind came strongest. There. They spent the entire day unloading. The tower sections, each one 20 feet of rusted steel, had to be moved carefully despite their corroded condition. The blades, massive curved wings designed to catch the wind, were surprisingly light but awkward to handle. By evening, the components lay scattered across his property, like the bones of some prehistoric creature. If you find this story engaging, Please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Dutch accepted his first payment, $200, that Thomas had scraped together by selling his late wife's engagement ring to a pawn shop, a betrayal that left him hollow inside. Before leaving, Dutch paused at his truck door. "You know what you're doing with this thing?" "No," Thomas admitted. Dutch nodded slowly, as if this answer made perfect sense. "Then I guess you'll figure it out. Or you won't. Either way, you chose something instead of nothing. That counts for something." After Dutch left, Thomas walked among the turbine parts as twilight deepened into night. He ran his hands over the cold metal, feeling the rough texture of rust and weather damage. This close, the turbine looked even more hopeless than it had at the auction. Sections of the tower were so corroded that he could push his finger through the thin spots. The blades had cracks running through their fiberglass shells. The nacelle, the housing that contained all the mechanical components, was sealed shut with rust and looked like it hadn't been opened in a decade. Behind him, he heard the crunch of tires on gravel. He turned to see Jake Morrison's truck pulling up, its headlights cutting through the darkness. Jake got out, followed by two other men from town, Bill Henderson and Pete Garza. They walked over slowly, taking in the scattered turbine parts, with expressions that mixed amusement with something darker. "Evening, Tom," Jake said, his voice carrying that false friendliness that was worse than open contempt. "Wanted to come see your new acquisition. Got to say, it's even more impressive in person." The other men chuckled. Bill, who owned the hardware store in town, shook his head. "Tom, seriously, what are you thinking? This thing is junk. You could have bought a decent used generator for $500, had actual power instead of whatever this is." "It's a wind turbine," Thomas said quietly. "It's a pile of rust," Pete corrected. "And even if you somehow get it standing, which you won't, it hasn't generated a watt of power in 15 years. The company that made these went bankrupt because they didn't work right even when they were new." Jake walked around the nacelle, touching it with his boot. "How much did you pay to have this hauled here?" "Wait, don't tell me. You probably spent another 500, maybe 1,000. Money you don't have, for equipment that's worthless." He looked at Thomas, with eyes that glittered with satisfaction. "Sarah wouldn't have wanted you to throw your life away like this." The mention of his wife's name, spoken with such casual cruelty, made Thomas's hands curl into fists. But he kept his voice steady. "Thanks for stopping by, gentlemen. I've got work to do." "Work?" Bill laughed. "Tom, you're not going to work on this thing. You can't. You don't have the equipment, the knowledge, or the money. Hell, you don't even have the land anymore. Face it, you made a mistake. A bad one. Best thing you can do is call a scrap company. Recoup whatever you can and stop embarrassing yourself." They stood there for a moment longer, waiting for him to respond, to defend himself, to give them more material for their stories. When he remained silent, they shrugged and walked back to their truck. As they drove away, Jake called out the window, "When you're ready to admit this was stupid, give me a call. I might be interested in your last 40 acres. At a fair price, of course." The red taillights disappeared down the road, and Thomas was alone again with his rusted giant and the wind that never stopped blowing across the Kansas plains. That night, he sat at his kitchen table with a bottle of whiskey he'd been saving, staring at technical diagrams he'd printed from the library's computer. The turbine was a Nordex N43 model, built in the late 90s when wind power was still new and ambitious. The diagrams showed a complex system of gears, generators, and control systems, all designed to convert the wind's kinetic energy into electricity. He knew nothing about electrical engineering. He'd barely graduated high school before taking over the farm from his father. Everything he knew about machinery came from maintaining tractors and irrigation systems. Looking at these diagrams felt like trying to read a foreign language. But Sarah had taught him something else during those last months. She'd shown him that impossibility was just another word for difficult, and difficult just meant it would take longer than you wanted. When the doctors said she had 6 months, she'd lived for 18, fighting for every morning, every sunset, every moment with her family. If she could do that, he thought, then he could figure out how to make a rusted wind turbine work. The next morning, Thomas began. He started with the simplest task, cleaning. He hauled buckets of water and wire brushes to the turbine components and began scrubbing away years of accumulated dirt and bird droppings. The work was mindless, mechanical, exactly what he needed. His hands moved while his mind wandered through memories of Sarah, of their daughters when they were young, of seasons when the farm had thrived, and the future had seemed certain. By afternoon, his back ached and his hands were raw, but the tower sections gleamed dully, the worst of the surface grime removed. He moved to the blades, running his hands along their length, finding every crack and weak point. The fiberglass was degraded, but the internal structure still seemed sound. Maybe, with enough epoxy and fiberglass cloth, he could reinforce them. He worked until dark, then collapsed into bed fully clothed, too exhausted to even eat. He dreamed of the turbine standing tall against the sky, its blades spinning in a blur of white motion. But when he woke, reality returned. Scattered metal parts, rust, doubt, but he got up and went back out, and the next day, and the next. Word spread through the county like a virus. People drove past his property slowly, gawking at the man, scrubbing rust off worthless metal. Some stopped to watch, offering commentary that ranged from mockery to pity. A few took photos, posting them on social media with captions like, "Local farmer loses mind, tries to rebuild ancient wind turbine," and "This is what desperation looks like." Thomas ignored them all. He developed a routine that started before dawn and ended long after dark. He taught himself to weld by watching videos on an old laptop he'd borrowed from the library, practicing on scrap metal until his beads were clean and strong. He learned about fiberglass repair, about electrical systems, about the mechanical principles that allowed wind to become power. Every evening, after the physical work was done, he studied. The library's computer became his classroom, and he downloaded every manual, every technical document, every forum post he could find about Nordex turbines. He learned that his model had been notorious for mechanical failures, particularly with the gearbox and pitch control system. He learned that replacement parts hadn't been manufactured in over a decade. He learned that even professional crews had struggled to keep these turbines running when they were new. He learned, in short, that everyone who said this was impossible was probably right, but he kept working. 3 weeks after the turbine arrived, his daughter Rachel drove out from Topeka. She found him in the barn, hunched over the turbine's electrical control panel, which he'd carefully removed from the nacelle. Wires and circuit boards spread across his workbench like the entrails of some mechanical beast. "Dad," she said softly from the doorway. He looked up, and the expression on her face, that mixture of love and heartbreak, almost undid him. "I'm okay, Rachel," he said, though they both knew it was a lie. She walked over, looking at the components spread before him. "Do you even know what you're doing?" "Learning as I go, Dad. People in town are talking. They're saying you've given up on reality, that you're wasting away out here, obsessing over a machine that's never going to work." She touched his shoulder gently. "I'm worried about you. We both are. Jennifer wants you to come stay with her in Kansas City for a while. Get away from this place." "I can't." "Why not? What's keeping you here?" "The farm is gone. Mom is gone. There's nothing left but this." She gestured at the turbine parts. "This obsession that's consuming you." Thomas set down his tools and looked at his daughter. Really looked at her. She had Sarah's eyes, that same mixture of strength and compassion. "You're right that your mother is gone," he said slowly. "And the farm. Most of it anyway. But I'm still here. And I need to know if I'm completely finished or if there's something left in me that can still build, still create, still matter. You matter to us. I know, but I need to matter to myself, Rachel. I need to prove that I'm not just the sum of my failures. She left, an hour later, unsatisfied, but understanding that he wouldn't be moved. As her car disappeared down the road, Thomas returned to the control panel and continued tracing circuits with a multimeter, hunting for breaks in connections that had corroded away years ago. The autumn winds began to blow stronger, carrying the smell of distant rain and the promise of winter. Thomas worked faster, driven by the knowledge that once snow fell, the work would become nearly impossible. He managed to lift the first tower section upright, using a come-along winch system he'd rigged from old farm equipment. It took him 3 days of careful work, but when that first 20-foot section finally stood vertical, anchored by temporary guy wires, he felt a surge of triumph that lasted exactly until he realized he had to lift the second section and somehow bolt it to the first. The visits from mockers became less frequent as the weather turned cold, but the few who still came provided enough material for the town's gossip. The story of crazy Tom Brennan and his impossible project became a kind of dark entertainment, a cautionary tale parents told their children about the dangers of losing your grip on reality. One afternoon, while Thomas was welding a reinforcement plate onto a corroded section of tower, a car he didn't recognize pulled up. An older man climbed out, dressed in khaki pants and a windbreaker, carrying a camera with a long lens. He approached carefully, as one might approach a wild animal. "Mr. Brennan, my name is Henry Wolcott. I'm a professor of renewable energy at Kansas State. I've heard about your project, and I have to admit, I'm curious. Would you mind if I took a look?" Thomas straightened, suspicious of more mockery disguised as interest. But something in the man's expression seemed genuine. "Help yourself." Wolcott spent the next hour examining everything. The tower sections, the blades, the nacelle, asking questions that showed actual technical knowledge. Finally, he stood back and shook his head with what looked like admiration. "Mr. Brennan, I'm impressed. You've done remarkable work considering your resources. The reinforcements you've added to the tower are actually quite clever." He paused. "But I have to be honest with you. This turbine, even if you get it assembled and standing, has almost no chance of producing usable power. The internal components are too degraded. The control systems are obsolete. The generator itself probably hasn't held a magnetic field in years. So everyone's right," Thomas said. "I'm wasting my time." "I didn't say that." Wolcott smiled. "Some things are worth doing even if they fail. The work itself matters. What you're learning matters. And who knows? Sometimes impossible things surprise us." He handed Thomas a business card. "If you ever want to talk about it, or if you need advice, call me. I mean that." After Wolcott left, Thomas stood for a long time, holding the card and staring at his partially assembled turbine. The second section now rose 40 feet into the air, and he'd managed to repair 2 of the 3 blades. From a distance, it almost looked like it might work. Up close, the flaws were obvious. The jury-rigged repairs, the mismatched bolts, the parts he'd fabricated from scrap, because originals no longer existed. But it was standing. That counted for something. Winter hit hard and early. The first snow came in mid-November, coating everything in white and making the turbine look like a ghost against the grey sky. Thomas worked through the cold, his fingers numb inside worn gloves, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. He'd moved a space heater into the barn, where he could work on the smaller components, but the main assembly had to happen outside, and the weather showed no mercy. On Thanksgiving, both his daughters called, begging him to come to them for the holiday. He made excuses, saying he was fine, eating a frozen dinner in his cold kitchen before going back to work. He couldn't stop now. Stopping meant admitting defeat. It meant acknowledging that everyone had been right about him. By December, he'd accomplished something he hadn't thought possible. All 3 tower sections were standing, bolted together, and reaching 70 feet into the sky. The blades were repaired and ready for mounting. The nacelle, still disassembled, filled his barn, but he'd cleaned and tested every component, replacing what he could and repairing what he couldn't replace. The impossible project was becoming merely improbable. On a clear, cold morning 2 days before Christmas, Thomas stood at the base of his turbine and began the most dangerous part. Using a gin pole and cable system that terrified him, he slowly raised the nacelle, the heart of the turbine, up the tower. It took all day, each inch gained through careful cranking of the winch while he prayed the cables would hold. When the nacelle finally settled onto the top of the tower and locked into place, Thomas's hands shook so badly he could barely secure the bolts. But he did it. The main assembly was complete. All that remained was attaching the 3 massive blades to the hub. He celebrated that night with a glass of Sarah's favorite wine, standing in the kitchen and toasting the empty room. "We're almost there," he whispered to the silence, unsure if he was talking to her ghost or to himself. The final push came between Christmas and New Year's. Thomas had borrowed more equipment than he strictly should have, called in favors from people who thought he was insane, but helped anyway because they'd known him their whole lives. With a borrowed crane and 3 nervous volunteers, he lifted the blades one by one, bolting them to the hub, 65 feet in the air. When the 3rd blade locked into place and the crane lowered away, Thomas stepped back and saw it complete for the first time. The turbine rose against the winter sky, its white blades stretching out like the arms of some mechanical angel, weathered and patched but whole. He'd done it. The impossible task was finished, but finishing the assembly was not the same as making it work. That night, as snow began to fall again, Thomas sat in his barn, surrounded by the electrical components he still needed to reconnect, the control systems he still needed to program, the generator he still needed to test. He'd built the body, but he hadn't yet given it life. And that, he was about to discover, was where the real work would begin. The first week of January brought a cold so intense that the wind seemed to cut through clothing and skin straight to the bone. Thomas worked in the nacelle, 70 feet above the frozen ground, his fingers clumsy with cold as he reconnected electrical systems and tested circuits. The wind at that height was relentless, rocking the tower just enough to remind him that one mistake, one slip, would send him falling to his death. He didn't care. Or rather, the part of him that should have cared had gone numb somewhere along the way. Each morning he climbed the rusty ladder, welded to the tower's side, and each evening he climbed down, having made small progress that never felt like enough. The reconnection work was painstakingly slow. Every wire had to be traced, tested, and sometimes replaced. The control computer, a dinosaur by modern standards, had to be reprogrammed using software so old he'd had to find it on abandoned websites. The generator's windings had to be tested for continuity, the gearbox drained and refilled with fresh oil, the hydraulic systems for the blade pitch control bled of air and recharged. He made mistakes, wired things backward, fried a circuit board with too much voltage, stripped bolts, cut himself on sharp metal edges until his hands were covered in band-aids and scabs. Every error felt like confirmation of what everyone had been saying, that he was a farmer pretending to be an engineer, a desperate man chasing an impossible dream. But he kept going because stopping meant confronting the emptiness of his life. As long as he was working on the turbine, he had purpose. The moment he admitted defeat, he'd have nothing left but a cold house and memories that hurt too much to examine. Late one evening in mid-January, as he was preparing to descend for the night, Thomas made one final connection, the main power cable from the generator to the control panel. His hands were shaking from exhaustion and cold, but he managed to secure the connection and flip the main breaker to the on position. Nothing happened. The turbine remained dead and silent, and Thomas felt something break inside his chest. He'd done everything he could think of, reconnected every system, tested every component, and still it wouldn't work. He climbed down slowly, each rung of the ladder seeming to require more effort than he had to give. At the bottom, he looked up at his turbine standing stark against the night sky, and for the first time since, "Sarah died," he cried. Not gentle tears, but racking sobs that came from somewhere deep and broken inside him. He'd failed. He'd spent his last money, his last energy, his last hope on a project that everyone said was impossible, and they'd been right all along. He went to bed that night without eating, without even removing his coat, and lay in the dark listening to the wind howl around the house. Somewhere in the depth of his exhaustion, he fell asleep and dreamed of Sarah. She stood in their kitchen, sunlight streaming through the window behind her, and she was smiling. "Tom," she said in the dream, her voice as clear as if she were really there. "You always did quit just before the miracle." He woke with a start, dawn light creeping through his window, those dream words echoing in his mind. Sarah had said something similar once, years ago, when he'd wanted to give up on a particularly stubborn tractor engine. He'd walked away in frustration, and she'd made him come back, made him try one more thing. The engine had started on the next attempt. One more thing, he thought. There had to be one more thing he hadn't tried. He dragged himself out of bed, made coffee strong enough to taste like punishment, and climbed back up the tower. In the grey morning light, he opened the control panel and studied it with fresh eyes. The connections all looked right. The power was flowing to where it needed to go. But something was wrong. Something he was missing. Then he saw it. A tiny toggle switch tucked away in the corner of the panel, labeled Emergency Stop. It was in the down position. In his exhaustion and focus on the complex systems, he'd overlooked the simplest safety feature. He'd left the emergency stop engaged. With a trembling finger, he flipped it up. The change was instantaneous. The control panel came to life, LED indicators blinking on in sequence. A low hum began deep in the nacelle as systems initialized. The blade pitch motors whirred softly, adjusting the angle of the blades to catch the wind. Thomas held his breath, watching, waiting. For a long moment, nothing else happened. Then, so slowly, he almost missed it. The blades began to move. Not fast, barely more than a crawl, but moving. The turbine was responding to the wind for the first time in 15 years. The movement built gradually as the control system optimized the blade pitch. The hum from the generator grew louder, higher pitched. The tower itself began to vibrate with a deep, resonant frequency that Thomas could feel through his feet. The blades rotated faster, cutting through the air with a whooshing sound that grew from a whisper to a rhythm. He climbed down quickly, nearly falling in his haste, and ran to the barn where he'd set up a simple display. The multimeter he'd left connected to the output terminals had been reading 0 for weeks. Now the numbers were climbing. 5 volts, 10, 20. The turbine was generating power. Thomas stood there, staring at those rising numbers, and felt something he hadn't felt in years. Not quite joy, but its echo. Validation. Proof that he wasn't completely finished. That some part of him could still create something that worked. He wanted to call someone, to share this moment. But who would he call? His daughters, who worried that he'd lost his mind? The neighbors who'd mocked him? Instead, he stood alone in his barn, watching the voltage climb and listening to the steady rhythm of the turbine blades cutting through the Kansas wind. The moment of triumph lasted about 10 minutes. Then the smell of burning insulation reached his nose, and smoke began pouring from the control panel. Thomas rushed to shut down the system, but before he could reach the emergency stop, something inside the nacelle made a grinding, metallic shriek. The blades stuttered to a halt, and the tower fell silent again. He climbed back up to find that one of the gearbox bearings, stressed beyond its limits by years of corrosion and his inexperienced repairs, had seized. The resulting strain had overloaded the control panel, frying several circuits before the safety systems kicked in. Thomas sat on the nacelle platform, his legs dangling over the edge, and laughed, not with humor, but with the kind of exhausted disbelief that comes when the universe delivers a punchline at exactly the worst moment. He'd made it work, proven it was possible, and then watched it destroy itself in minutes. He spent the next 3 days repairing the damage, ordered replacement circuits from an electronics supplier, nearly wiping out his checking account to have them rush shipped, disassembled the gearbox enough to replace the seized bearing with one he fabricated from parts of an old tractor transmission. It wasn't exact, wasn't perfect, but it might work. While he worked, word of his brief success must have leaked somehow, because the visitors returned. But this time, they came with a different energy. Jake Morrison showed up with 2 other men, standing at the base of the tower and looking up with expressions that mixed curiosity with something darker. "Heard you got it running for a few minutes before it broke," Jake called up. "That true?" Thomas didn't answer, focused on his work. "Because if it is true," Jake continued, "even for a few minutes, that means this whole thing isn't completely worthless. Might actually be worth something as salvage, now that you've fixed the basic problems." Thomas looked down. "It's not for sale." Jake's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Everything's for sale, Tom. It's just a matter of price. I'm willing to offer you $2,000 for the turbine and equipment. Cash. Today. That's more than you paid for it. Plus it gets this thing off your property before it falls on someone, and you get sued." "Not interested." "5,000, Jake said, his voice hardening. "That's my final offer. More money than you've seen in 2 years. Take it, Tom. Take it and walk away before this thing kills you or bankrupts you completely." I said no. Jake stared up at him for a long moment, then spat on the ground. "You're a stubborn fool, Brennan. Always have been. When this thing fails again, and it will, don't come crying to me." He turned and walked back to his truck, the other men following. Thomas watched them drive away, then returned to his repairs. Jake's visit had told him something important. If people were offering money for the turbine, even with all its problems, then it must have more value than he'd thought. The question was, why? What could possibly make a half-broken, obsolete wind turbine worth thousands of dollars to someone like Jake Morrison? The answer came to him 3 days later, when he climbed into the nacelle to install the new bearing. As he was removing panels to access the gearbox, his wrench slipped and struck the inner wall of the housing. Instead of the solid metal thunk he expected, the sound that came back was hollow, almost like knocking on wood. Puzzled, he tapped again. Same hollow sound. The nacelle's outer skin was steel, but this sounded like there was empty space behind it. He studied the wall more carefully and noticed what looked like a welded seam running vertically, covered by layers of paint and rust. Someone had modified this section after the original manufacture. His heart beginning to pound, Thomas found a hammer and chisel and began carefully cutting through the weld. The metal was thinner than the rest of the structure, easier to penetrate. After 20 minutes of work, he'd created an opening large enough to shine a flashlight through. The beam illuminated something that made no sense. The hollow space was packed with packages wrapped in plastic. He reached in carefully and pulled one out. Through the cloudy plastic, he could see the unmistakable green of U.S. currency. Stacks and stacks of $100 bills. Thomas sat back hard, the flashlight dropping from his numb fingers. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. Someone had hidden money inside the turbine. A lot of money. Before the wind farm had been abandoned 15 years ago. With shaking hands, he removed more of the panel. The cavity was larger than he'd thought, running nearly the length of the nacelle, and it was filled with plastic-wrapped bundles. He pulled them out one by one, stacking them on the platform, his breath coming in short gasps. When he'd removed them all, he counted 43 bundles. He opened one carefully, his hands trembling so badly he could barely manage it. Inside were neat stacks of $100 bills, each stack banded with a paper strip indicating $10,000. The bundle contained 5 stacks, $50,000, times 43. Thomas did the math 3 times, certain he was making an error, but the number remained the same, $2,150,000, hidden inside a turbine that everyone, including him, had thought was worthless. He sat there for a long time, trying to process what this meant. Someone had used the failed wind farm as a hiding place, probably thinking the turbines would be dismantled quickly and they could retrieve the money. But when the company went bankrupt and the turbines were abandoned for years, the money had stayed hidden, waiting, and now it was his. Or was it? Thomas's mind churned through the implications. This was almost certainly criminal money, hidden by someone involved with the wind farm project. Drug money, maybe, or embezzled funds. If he reported it, the money would be seized, investigated, tied up in legal proceedings for years. He'd be lucky to see a penny of it. But if he kept it quiet, the thought felt dangerous even to consider. He was a farmer, a man who'd lived his entire life following the rules, paying his taxes, doing the right thing. This money wasn't his. He hadn't earned it. But his last $500 had been earned, and he'd spent it on the turbine that contained this fortune. He'd invested months of backbreaking work, had endured mockery and pity, had risked his life climbing this tower in the dead of winter. In a way, he'd earned the right to this discovery more than whoever had hidden it here 15 years ago. Thomas carefully rewrapped the money and lowered it down using a rope, making multiple trips until all the bundles were hidden in his barn. Then he sealed the cavity back up, making it look as undisturbed as possible. If someone came looking, they'd find nothing. He finished installing the new bearing in a daze, his hands working automatically while his mind raced. That evening, as the sun set in a spectacular display of orange and purple, he completed the repairs and prepared to test the turbine again. This time, when he flipped the emergency stop switch, the startup sequence went smoothly. The blades began to turn, the generator hummed to life, and the power output climbed steadily, 50 kilowatts, enough to power his entire farm with plenty to spare. Enough to prove that the impossible project had succeeded, but Thomas barely noticed. He stood in his barn, the turbine's rhythm a steady thrum in the background, and stared at 43 plastic-wrapped bundles that represented more money than he'd ever dreamed of having. The question that kept him awake that night wasn't how to spend it. It was whether he had the courage to keep it. The next morning, Thomas woke to find his property covered in fresh snow. The turbine stood against the pale sky, its blades turning slowly in the gentle wind, generating power that now fed into his house through the connection he'd finally completed. For the first time in months, his lights came on without the sputter and fade of the backup generator he'd been nursing along. The normality of it flipping a switch, and having light felt miraculous after so long without. He made coffee, stronger than usual because his hands were shaking, and sat at his kitchen table, staring at the barn, where $2 million in cash lay hidden under a tarp. In the stark light of morning, the discovery felt less like a blessing and more like a test he wasn't sure he could pass. His phone rang, startling him. It was Rachel. "Dad, I heard from someone that your turbine is working. Is that true?" News traveled fast in a small county. "Yeah, got it running yesterday." That's amazing. I'm so proud of you." Her voice caught. "I know we doubted you. I doubted you. I'm sorry." "Don't be," Thomas said, surprised by the tightness in his own throat. "You were right to worry. Can I come see it this weekend? Bring Jennifer and the kids?" He hesitated. Having them here, with that money hidden in the barn, felt dangerous. But he'd been pushing them away for so long. I'd like that a lot." After they hung up, Thomas went to the barn and stared at the hidden bundles. He needed to make a decision. Keep the money and all the risks that came with it, or turn it in and go back to being broke. When he really examined his choices, He realized there was no clean path forward. Keeping the money meant lying to his daughters, to the authorities, to everyone. Turning it in meant investigations, questions he couldn't answer, and possibly being accused of theft himself. He thought about what Sarah would say. She'd been the moral compass of their marriage, the one who kept him honest when cutting corners seemed easier. But Sarah wasn't here, and the world hadn't been kind since she'd left. The hospital bills that had drained their savings, the drought that had killed his crops, the neighbors who'd circled like vultures, waiting for him to fail completely. He made his decision. That afternoon, Thomas drove to the bank in the county seat, 40 miles away where no one knew him. He opened a safety deposit box and deposited 10 bundles of cash, $500,000. The rest he hid in various places around his property. In walls, underground, in places no one would think to look. He kept one bundle accessible, planning carefully how he'd use it. The money had to be spent slowly, carefully, in ways that wouldn't raise suspicion. Cash transactions under $10,000 to avoid bank reporting requirements. Small improvements spread over time. Patience. He started with the basics. Bought supplies for repairs he'd been putting off. Fixed the barn's sagging wall. Replaced the worn-out tires on his truck. To anyone watching, these were the actions of a man being careful with limited resources, not someone who'd found a fortune. When his daughters arrived that weekend, they found the farm transformed. Not dramatically, but noticeably. Fresh paint on the porch, repairs to the roof. Small things that added up to a place that was being cared for again, instead of slowly dying. Jennifer's twin boys, 8 years old and full of energy, went wild when they saw the turbine. Thomas took them up in the nacelle, carefully, one at a time, and showed them how the wind became electricity. Their excitement reminded him why he'd started this project. Not for money, but to prove that broken things could be fixed, that lost causes weren't always lost. "Grandpa, you're like a superhero," the younger twin, Michael, said solemnly. "You built a giant windmill all by yourself." Thomas ruffled his hair, throat tight with emotion. Not a superhero, buddy, just stubborn. That evening, sitting on the porch with his daughters while the boys ran in the yard, Rachel asked the question he'd been dreading. "Dad, how are you managing? I mean, financially. All these repairs, the work on the turbine, that must have cost money you don't have." He'd prepared for this. Been selling some things. Old equipment, scrap metal. The turbine's generating power now, so my electric bill's gone. It adds up. It was close enough to the truth that the lie didn't choke him. They seemed to accept it. And the conversation moved on. But later, when everyone was asleep, Thomas stood in his barn and looked at the hidden money and felt the weight of the secret pressing down on him. The weeks that followed fell into a new pattern. Thomas maintained the turbine, which ran smoothly now, generating consistent power. He began making small improvements to the farm, always careful not to spend so much that people would wonder. He paid his overdue property taxes, bought a used tractor to replace the one he'd sold, started planting again in the spring, just a few acres of wheat to test the soil. The money gave him breathing room, but it also brought constant anxiety. Every visitor made him worry they'd somehow discover the truth. Every night he lay awake, wondering if whoever had hidden the money would come looking for it. Every time a strange car drove past his property, his heart rate spiked. But no one came. The weeks became months, and life slowly stabilized. The turbine became a minor local celebrity, written up in the regional paper as a feel-good story about determination and ingenuity. A few renewable energy enthusiasts made pilgrimages to see it, and Thomas gave careful tours that never ventured too close to his barn. In town, the mockery had stopped. People who'd called him crazy now treated him with a grudging respect. Jake Morrison still eyed him with hostility, but even Jake had backed off after Thomas quietly paid cash for a used harvester from one of Jake's competitors. Summer brought the first real harvest Thomas had managed in years. The wheat grew strong, and though it was only a small crop, it represented something important. He was farming again. The land was producing. He was rebuilding his life, though the foundation of that rebuilding rested on a secret that could destroy everything if revealed. On a warm evening in July, almost 6 months after finding the money, Thomas sat on his porch and watched the turbine blades turn against the sunset sky. The rhythm had become so familiar, it was like listening to his own heartbeat. He'd proven everyone wrong. He'd taken something worthless and made it valuable. He'd survived. But the question that haunted him wasn't about survival. It was about cost. What had he given up in exchange for this stability? His integrity? His honesty? The man Sarah had loved and trusted? He was still wrestling with these thoughts when headlights appeared on the road. A car he didn't recognize pulled into his driveway, and 2 men in suits climbed out. Thomas's stomach dropped. Even before they showed their badges, he knew. Federal agents. Finally, someone had come looking. "Mr. Brennan?" the older agent said. "I'm Agent Harrison. This is Agent Cole, FBI. We'd like to talk to you about your wind turbine." Thomas stood slowly, his mouth dry. This was it. The moment everything fell apart. What about it? "May we come inside?" They sat in his kitchen, and Agent Harrison pulled out a file folder. 15 years ago, a man named Victor Petrov was the project manager for the wind farm that operated here. The project failed, but investigators later discovered that Petrov had been embezzling money from investors. About $2 million was never recovered. Petrov died in a car accident before he could be prosecuted. Thomas forced himself to breathe normally, to show nothing. 8. "I don't understand what this has to do with me. We've been quietly investigating the wind farm site for years," Agent Cole said. "When we heard you'd purchased one of the turbines and were working on it, we became interested. Those turbines were the last place Petrov was seen before his death. We've always suspected he hid the money somewhere on site." Agent Harrison leaned forward. "Mr. Brennan, did you find anything unusual when you were working on the turbine? Anything that seemed out of place or hidden?" This was the moment. Thomas could lie, claim he'd found nothing, and live with the secret forever. Or he could tell the truth and lose everything he'd carefully built over these months. He thought about his daughters, about his grandchildren, about the farm, about Sarah. What would she do? He knew the answer. She'd always known the answer, even when it was hard. "Yes," Thomas heard himself say. "I found something." He led them to the barn, to the tarp-covered bundles. As the agents began documenting the money, Harrison turned to him. "Why didn't you report this when you found it?" Thomas looked at the agent, then at the cash that represented his lost future. "Because I'm tired. Tired of losing, tired of failing, tired of watching everything fall apart. That money felt like the universe finally paying me back for everything it had taken." He paused. "But it wasn't mine. I knew it wasn't mine." The agents worked for hours, counting and cataloging. When they finished, Agent Harrison handed Thomas a receipt. "This will be held as evidence during the investigation. Eventually, there may be a finder's fee, but that process takes time. You understand?" "I understand." After they left, taking the money with them, Thomas stood in his empty barn and waited to feel the relief of confession. It didn't come. What came instead was exhaustion. The bone-deep weariness of someone who'd been carrying a heavy weight and finally set it down. He walked outside and looked up at his turbine, still turning steadily in the night wind. The project that had started as madness become an obsession and led to temptation. In the end, it had forced him to choose who he wanted to be. He'd made his choice. He'd lost the money, but kept himself. That night, he slept better than he had in months. The investigation took 6 weeks. Federal agents crawled over every detail of the turbine's history, interviewed Thomas repeatedly, and examined his finances with microscopic attention. Throughout it all, Thomas told the truth. About buying the turbine, about the money, about keeping it for months before turning it in. They found no evidence that he'd known about the money before purchasing the turbine. No connection between him and Viktor Petrov. Nothing except an honest man who'd discovered a fortune and made a very human mistake before correcting it. In the end, they believed him. More importantly, the state of Kansas believed him. Under state law, unclaimed funds found on private property could be claimed by the finder after a waiting period if no rightful owner came forward. Petrov was dead. The original investors had been partially repaid through insurance. No one had a stronger claim to the money than Thomas. 12 months after he'd turned the money in, Thomas received a registered letter from the state. After legal fees and administrative costs, he was awarded $1,847,000 as the finder of abandoned property. The money was legally his. This time, there was no temptation to hide it. He deposited it in a bank, paid his taxes on it, and hired an accountant to help manage it properly. Word spread quickly through the county, and the story transformed again. The crazy farmer who'd bought a worthless turbine and found a fortune. Local media picked it up. National media followed. For a few weeks, Thomas was famous. He hated every minute of it. But some good came from the attention. The state's Renewable Energy Board offered him a grant to upgrade his turbine with modern components. A wind energy company hired him as a consultant, wanting to learn from his hands-on experience with an older system. Schools invited him to speak about persistence and following through on impossible projects. He accepted some invitations and declined others, always uncomfortable with being called an inspiration. "I bought junk," he'd tell people. "Got lucky." Not much of a story. But people saw something more. They saw a man who'd lost everything and refused to quit, who'd faced mockery and kept working, who'd found wealth and then chose integrity over comfort. The story resonated because everyone understood failure, and most people dreamed of redemption. What Thomas knew, and couldn't quite articulate, was that the money was the least important part. The real treasure had been the work itself. Those months of struggling with the turbine had given him a reason to wake up, a purpose beyond survival. The turbine had saved him long before he'd discovered what was hidden inside it. 2 years after buying the turbine, Thomas stood at the dedication of the Brennan Wind Education Center, a small facility he'd built on his property, using some of the money. It housed his original turbine, now fully restored and maintained, along with educational displays about renewable energy and persistence. Students came regularly, brought by teachers who used Thomas's story as a lesson about determination. Farmers came to learn about installing their own turbines. Engineers came to study his creative solutions to technical problems. Rachel and Jennifer came for the dedication, bringing their families. Thomas watched his grandchildren run around the base of the turbine, the same way they had on that first visit, and felt Sarah's presence so strongly he almost turned around expecting to see her. Later, standing on the nacelle platform as the sun set, Thomas looked out over his land. The wheat grew strong in fields he'd replanted. The barn stood straight and solid, properly repaired. The house was warm and comfortable, no longer falling apart. The turbine turned steadily, still generating power, still proving that impossible things sometimes worked out. He thought about the laughter that had followed him through the darkest months, the voices that called him crazy, foolish, a waste. They'd been wrong, but not in the way most people thought. They'd been wrong because they'd measured his project by whether it would work, when the real measure was whether the trying would save him. It had. The money was nice. The vindication was satisfying. But what mattered most was that he'd learned something about himself that he'd needed to know. When everything fell apart, he could rebuild. When everyone said it was impossible, he could prove them wrong. When temptation came, he could choose to be the man Sarah had believed he was. That evening, as the stars emerged and the turbine's blades caught the last light, Thomas made a phone call to Henry Wolcott, the professor who'd visited so long ago. They'd stayed in touch, and Wolcott had helped with the education center. "Henry, I've been thinking," There are other turbines out there, abandoned, written off. What if we bought them, restored them, used them to teach? Walcott was quiet for a moment. Thomas, do you know how much work that would be? How many could fail? Thomas smiled. Yeah, I know exactly how much work it would be. So, are you interested? The professor laughed. You're still crazy, you know that? Maybe, but it's a good kind of crazy. They talked for another hour, planning and dreaming. After they hung up, Thomas sat in the darkness and listened to the steady rhythm of his turbine. The sound that had once meant madness now meant possibility. The following spring, Thomas bought his second turbine at an auction in Nebraska. This time, when people laughed, he smiled and kept working. He knew something they didn't. Sometimes, the broken things no one else wants turn out to hold the most value, not because of what they are, but because of what fixing them teaches you about yourself. But the real vindication came later that summer, when Jake Morrison's ranch hit hard times. A summer drought, combined with falling cattle prices, left Jake scrambling to make his loan payments. Thomas heard through the grapevine that Jake was selling off equipment and considering selling part of his land. One evening, Jake's truck pulled into Thomas's driveway. Jake got out slowly, his shoulders hunched in a way Thomas had never seen before. The arrogance was gone, replaced by something that looked like shame. "Tom," Jake said, unable to meet his eyes, "I heard you're hiring help for your education center. I was wondering if you might have any work available." Thomas looked at the man who'd mocked him so cruelly, who'd come to gawk at his failure, who'd offered to buy his land at a fair price, assuming he'd eventually collapse. Part of him wanted to say no, to let Jake feel the same helplessness he'd felt. But Sarah's voice echoed in his mind again. "My foreman position just opened up," Thomas said. "Pays well. Benefits included. You'd be helping maintain the turbines and teaching visitors about wind energy. Think you can handle that?" Jake's head snapped up, surprise and relief flooding his face. Yes. Thank you, Tom. I won't let you down." "I know you won't," Thomas said, and meant it. Watching Jake drive away that evening, Thomas realized that the truest form of vindication wasn't crushing those who doubted you. It was being strong enough to lift them up when they fell. The laughter didn't bother him anymore. He'd learned to hear beyond it, to the whisper of wind that moved across the plains, waiting patiently for someone stubborn enough to listen. And Thomas Brennan was listening still. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.